In 1888, a satirical sketch appeared in the Victorian magazine, Funny Folks. It was a send-up of a real-life trial.
You say the prisoner was begging in the Strand?
Yes, Your Worship.
The policeman's real name was Sergeant Holmes, but to the wags at the magazine Funny Folks, he was Constable Robert Emotional. The joke's in the name, you see.
Please, Your Honour, he said he hadn't tasted food for 2 whole days and he had a starving family at home.
And so I have, worse luck.
You hear him, Your Worship? Isn't it pitiful?
I must point out, Constable, that these exhibitions of feeling are slightly out of place in a police court. The prisoner will go to jail for 7 days. A policeman in tears. Extraordinary. The press had a field day, the public were aghast, and Robert Emotional became a figure of fun. Because by the 1880s, this sort of behaviour was simply not acceptable. Englishmen and English women across society just didn't get emotional in public.
Nowadays, of course, if we don't show our feelings, we're said to be cold and labelled repressed. We may see the benefits of being more sensitive, but don't like the thought of being touchy-feely. Males, for example, are encouraged to act like new men, and then they get told to man up. Are we meant to be emotional or not? It's terribly confusing.
As an English public school boy with a Scottish Presbyterian background, you can imagine what a representative of emotional literacy I am. But the Victorians had no such doubts.
This was the period when the ideal of the stiff upper lip reached its zenith. It produced a parade of fair-playing heroes, valiant soldiers, and intrepid explorers.
It made the people fearless, doubt-free, self-confident, or heartless, imagination-free, and self-denying. But how did Britons of all ranks come to buy into the idea that repressing your emotions was the way to get through life? And what were the consequences?
It was famously said of the Battle of Waterloo that it was won on the playing fields of Eton. That was a tribute to the character of men turned out by the English public school. I'm heading back to my own, which, for good or ill, undeniably helped shape mine.
When I used to come back at the beginning of term, I was initially, I'm always a bit homesick. I was leaving my parents, I'm leaving my sister. But then there was also an excitement. I mean, I was going to see my friends again. It certainly made you very independent from an early age. The central attitude was, you know, don't make a fuss about it, get on with it. Which we all did.
This is Ardingly College in West Sussex.
This is it, where I got dropped off from the ages of 8 to 18. Usually with a trunk, huge trunk and a tuck box, and you have to get someone to help you carry it up the stairs.
Ardingly may now look like a conservative institution. But when it was founded in 1858, it embodied educational reform and a progressive mindset. Public schools in the past, like Eton, Harrow and Rugby, had been mainly for the aristocracy. But by the 1850s, aspirational parents from the growing middle classes thought that their boys, if taught the same values, would also measure up. a wave of new schools was founded, where these boys could be taught to be gentlemen. Ardingly's founder, who set up 9 of these schools, was very clear on how to do this.
Now, there he is, the founder, Nathaniel Woodard. A severe-looking man. He wrote a terrific document called A Plea for the Middle Classes, and he lays it all out. It's for gentlemen of small incomes, and by this he includes the sons of clergy, sons of army and navy, sons of solicitors, sons of tradesmen, and the important thing was to get them here. He wrote, the chief thing to be desired is to remove the child from the noxious influence of home.
So, the suggestion was that these bad influences actually included parents, and certainly covered home comforts.
My dormitory was up there. 35 boys, 1 room, no curtains, not much heating. A good view.
You weren't meant to show emotion in front of your fellows. You weren't meant to blub when you said goodbye to your mummy at the railway station. You weren't meant to blub when people hit you very hard with sticks, even though it's a perfectly normal thing to do, to blub. And therefore, it's probably created the most extraordinary psychological types, which we still see living with us in England today.
At public schools across the country in the mid-19th century, masters increasingly strove to mould boys into men who would be a credit to Britannia, whether serving her at home or in the Empire. Training began in the classroom, where the key subject on the curriculum was classics, Greek and Latin.
Aeneas and his men have been wrecked on the shore of Libya, and he's now about to speak to his men.
I'll just join in.
Talia woci refert, curis quen gentibus aeger,
To learn how to govern, boys were introduced to inspiring role models, ancient heroes like the poet Virgil's Aeneas.
Such words he spoke, while sick with deep distress he feigns hope on his face and deep in his heart stifles his pain.
What do you think, what qualities do you think Aeneas is showing as a leader here? What is he trying to do for his men?
He's showing a sense of steadfastness. He can't let out his emotions.
What it also says here, durati, which very modern could be translated as kind of man up.
Yeah.
Putting on a brave face.
And is that a good quality in a leader?
I think it's an essential quality for a leader.
To pretend everything's going fine?
Well, in this situation, yes.
It's almost kind of a, you know, a prototype for how the English thought, you know, they could act. The young British men out in the colonies, for example, would take on the role of Aeneas.
Outside the classroom, equally essential lessons in conduct were being taught.
Good stuff, here we go, play! Good!
Discipline on the sports field.
Hold your run! Good, off you go, Johnny! Off you go, Johnny! Brilliant, well played!
And morality in chapel. A popular new idea summed up the spirit of the age, that godliness need not exclude manliness, a combination dubbed muscular Christianity.
Good, keep it moving, keep it moving!
There was a worry that hearty, virile boys might see Jesus as a bit wet, so his teaching needed beefing up.
Different cast, mate, well done! Play!
Well, I mean, you can't imagine putting Jesus in charge of a hill station in India or a regiment, because obviously the fellow wouldn't have any discipline. And so muscular Christianity is obviously the exaltation of strength. It's the idea that a decent person keeps order, both over himself and over the world, with a bit of help from the Almighty, but if the Almighty is not interested, an English person can do it on his own.
Everything about schools like Ardingly was designed to work together in a sort of social, almost moral engineering project. The physical education on the playing field, the spiritual education in chapel, a very particular classical education in the classroom, all working together to create a product. The English gentleman, the British officer, the imperial administrator. And in 1864, a royal commission, no less, made it official. It declared that the public school, at best, could be used as an instrument for the training of character, where boys could learn to govern others and to control themselves.
From all sides, Victorian boys absorbed the principle that while emotions may be felt, they should never be shown. Not that this was always easy. These are the letters home from a boy called Charles Herbert Shaw, Charlie, writing to his mother, who he addresses as Dear Ma. The last 3 or 4 days it's been raining. Sunday was very hot. I went out with a master and got some violets and primroses. I send you one of the violets, and he's put it in, you can still see the mark of it. The cricketing season is coming on. There's a new railway which is being built. I have nothing more to say. I remain your affectionate son, Charlie. A year later, that formal attitude has something rather more serious to deal with. Dear Ma, I have a very sad letter to write to you. During the last week, scarlatina, scarlet fever, has broke out. One boy named Moore in schoolhouse dormitory died very suddenly last Wednesday, the 23rd. They say another boy is ill and not expected to live. I suppose you've received the circular which the college has sent. What I want to know is that, am I coming home? He then says, thanks for the flags of all nations. I'm glad you enjoyed yourself when you were at Southport. A week later, he writes again. He hasn't gone home. His parents haven't come and picked him up. He says the fever is still going strong. Between 20 to 30 boys are ill with it. 5 boys are prayed for. Only 28 boys are left. Then having described this sort of rampaging epidemic, he says, I'm sorry, you've got a cold. And then tells his mother, I'm learning algebra. And then he signs off Charlie. And it is the extraordinary jump in tone. You can almost feel the sense of someone learning a process of dealing with their emotions. These things happen. He's been left there to stick it out, because that's what you do. And you do it by restraint. Unlike several of his classmates, 14-year-old Charles Herbert Shaw survived the scarlet fever. He went on to a career in the army, a successful product of the system. The model for Victorian manhood was now established, but it was widely believed that a good dose of emotional restraint would fortify the women too, despite the less promising raw material. Middle-class women, conditioned to be wives and mothers, were learning how to minister to the shrine of the Victorian home, and to preserve a haven of calm and happiness, no matter what life threw at them.
Their lives were extraordinarily difficult, giving birth to any number of children, well over 5 or 6, and losing some of them and suffering enormously in childbirth. So they are having to exhibit a steeliness on the home front that is basically the equivalent of stiff upper lip.
They are very good at suffering. That's what all the literature about women in this period says. Women are very good at maternal altruism, sacrificing themselves and suffering in silence. This is a very backhanded compliment, of course, to say to women, you're so great at suffering and having no power, please carry on doing it.
Women not only had to manage their own feelings, they were also expected to steady the ship for those around them. This duty was the subject of popular paintings, like this one by George Elgar Hicks at the Museum of London.
This painting is called Companion of Manhood, and it's part of a triptych called Woman's Mission. And this is quite literally a depiction of what the mission is. It is to support the man in every way possible. This is a beautifully run home. Breakfast things are all in order. There are fresh flowers. Fire is stoked. The woman has done everything. But, as happens in tragic Victorian pictures, something awful has happened. And we can tell that because the husband has opened the letter, dropped the envelope, which has a black border, so someone has died. There's been some tragedy, and his face, which you're drawn to up the diagonal, his face is hidden in his hands. What we can see is the reaction of the woman, and her face there is, it's noble, it's compassionate, it's restrained. The implication for the viewer is that without the woman, without her solid presence, the man might just lose it. He might start blubbing, he might fall apart. The woman is there for her husband, offering, quite literally, tea and sympathy.
For these companions of manhood across the country, guidance was helpfully at hand in the form of instruction manuals. Not for the women the advice of ancient poets, but instead the sage words of a Mrs. Sarah Ellis. Mrs. Ellis urged the women of England to bear pain with cheerfulness and resignation, and to engage in moral work in a domestic setting. And this is clear from the titles of her best-selling books: Daughters of England, Wives of England, Mothers of England, and the works are full of words like influence, responsibility, and character. But Mrs. Ellis also recommends something key to the development of the psychology of the stiff upper lip in the decades to come. By the mastery of judgment over impulse, she, the ideal woman of England, will be able in time not only to appear calm, but really to feel so. What she's arguing is that by controlling their facial expressions, and consequently the feelings that give rise to them, her readers will be able to train their emotions and bury them so deep they don't even have to acknowledge them. That level of emotional reserve would later come to be seen as emotional repression, and once Freud started his work on the human psyche, would be considered to be potentially extremely damaging. Self-control was now becoming a hallmark of the British middle class. But it would take a violent and bloody event overseas, the Crimean War of the 1850s, to demonstrate that this quality might also be found in the lower orders.
This is Britain's first public memorial dedicated to all ranks. The allegorical figure at the top is Honour, bestowing her tributes on 3 common soldiers. These are privates. Their faces are carved ideally. They are looking determined, resolute, and noble. Now, for much of Britain's long and extremely martial history, the ordinary rank-and-file soldier was not considered to be statue material. Too often they were perceived as lazy, drunk, ill-disciplined, thieving, mutinous, or worse. The Duke of Wellington once memorably referred to his own army as the scum of the earth. But this monument shows what changed in the Victorian era. It was a more democratic ideal, in tune with the spirit of the times. Now, any Briton could be put on a national pedestal.
This change in public opinion was not a consequence of anything new in how the war was waged, but in how it was seen back home. Thanks to the new medium of photography, civilians could see documentary images of the battlefield. And with the rapid development of the telegraph, news could be sent home in hours. Moreover, the reports were not glorified eulogies, but damning indictments of a bungled campaign, which cost over 20,000 Britons their lives on the battlefield and from disease.
It was total blundering, stupidity and incompetence from beginning to end by the politicians, by the senior soldiers and the officer class. And indeed it exposed the officer class and the idiotic way in which they've been running the army ever since Waterloo.
In contrast to their officers, the character of the ordinary soldiers shone through. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. That bittersweet line from Tennyson's much-loved poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, epitomised a nation's pride and sympathy for its heroes. In 1856, the Queen was moved to create the first Medal for Valour to be awarded to servicemen of any rank, the Victoria Cross. A reputation for duty and resilience under fire is one of which the British squaddy remains proud. Of those original Crimean VCs, 8 were awarded to members of the Rifle Brigade. Today, the 4th Battalion, the Rifles, is based in Bulford, near Salisbury.
If there's an upper body injury, obviously you can man up slightly, try and limp to the next marker if you've got a...
In 2013, they will be returning to Afghanistan for a second tour of duty.
And one man, go and get help from the marker or any of the PT staff. Questions? Awesome.
The idea of the British soldier, of you guys, is that you don't complain, you can handle anything, you're unflappable, you don't show it. Is that what it's like?
Well, when you're here in the rain, everyone moans, but when you're out there, you don't mind at all because it's your job, isn't it?
You're there to protect the bloke left and right of you, so you just have to get on with it.
And you've got a lot of foreigners around you, you're in someone else's country, you've got to be a certain person, haven't you?
Yeah. You've got to put a face on to the public to show them that you're strong enough to handle the situation. So if you're going out on a patrol and you look scared, they ain't going to have confidence in you.
As a nation, we've a lot of respect for those who brave danger in war zones in the national interest. But we also have a peculiar regard for Brits attempting feats that are not just perilous, but arguably pointless. And that too dates back to the stiff upper lips Victorian heyday. Meet Captain Matthew Webb. A merchant seaman from Shropshire with a fine moustache and a strong competitive streak, he accepted every challenge for its own sake. In 1874, Webb took on an unlikely opponent in a swimming contest. A Newfoundland dog.
Newfoundlands are very popular with fishermen. They have a well-deserved reputation for being able to stay in the water for a long time. Webb boasted that he had greater stamina than any dog. So bets were taken and both competitors entered a fairly choppy sea. An hour and a half later, the dog gave up, went back to its master's boat, whimpering to be let back on board. Webb was declared the victor. Never a man to rest on his laurels, he then said he would take on the ultimate challenge. He would boldly go where no man had been before. The final frontier, France. He would swim the English Channel.
Webb's challenge was deemed impossible by fellow swimmers, and to the French it was une folie anglaise.
When it comes to, if you like, the display of stiff upper lip, demonstrating it, performing it, there is something peculiarly British. This does have something to do with the sheer enjoyment of the absurdity of this kind of survival, of surviving for the sake of surviving. It's a kind of masochism.
Masochistic or heroic? You decide. On one of the coldest days of the year, Bryn Dymott is here in Dover, training to swim the channel in the wake of his hero, Webb.
Hi, Bryn.
Oh, hi, Ian.
What are you putting on yourself?
Bit of Vaseline, just
Right.
to help. Bit salty in there.
And is that what they would always have put on?
No, in the past, swimmers would have used lanolin, that sort of channel grease. That's what most people would use for a real solo tent.
What about Captain Webb?
He used porpoise oil.
Porpoise oil?
Porpoise oil, yes. Really smelly stuff. Believed that it would offer him a little bit of thermal protection.
And did it?
I don't know, but we do know that it attracted the porpoises, and it's rumoured or written that the porpoises came and had a little swim with him during his crossing.
And is Captain Webb, he's a hero of yours?
Absolutely. He was the very first person to swim the channel. 1875, and he did it breaststroke.
Was it a more gentlemanly stroke?
Very.
You could see what you were doing?
Absolutely, and well, Matthew Webb had all sorts of tricks that he would perform in the water.
Right.
Breaststroking, eating, drinking, glass of port in one hand, a cigar in the other. It's true.
Do you do any of that?
No. No. Why? Would you have a glass of port handy? No.
I'm sorry to ask this, but no wetsuit?
Definitely not. You can swim.
Is that offensive?
No, well, no, it's not. But if you want to use a wetsuit, that's fine. But Matthew Webb didn't. And I want to be a channel swimmer, not somebody who has swum the channel. There's a difference. A channel swimmer doesn't wear a wetsuit.
Fair enough. Look, I'm not going to hold you up any further. You must get on.
Thank you very much.
You're obviously not feeling the cold. No, I am not going to join
Sure.
you.
All right. Okay. Well, it was nice of you to come down.
On the 24th of August 1875, a small crowd gathered here in Dover to watch Webb set off for his toughest endurance test yet.
Webb had to battle turning tides, agonising pains in his muscles and being stung by a jellyfish, but he swam on at a steady 22 strokes a minute. For sustenance, the crew in the boat accompanying him handed him beef tea, brandy and beer, and halfway across, a nice cold glass of cod liver oil. For the last 2 hours, according to a journalist who was along for the ride, it was perfect torture. Webb slowed down to 12 strokes a minute, and he was heard to cry out, "This sea is killing me by inches."
After 22 excruciating hours, Webb eventually reached the shores of Calais.
So how did he feel, as all good journalists are primed to ask then and now? Had he been on a journey? Had he given it 110%? Had it always been his dream? No, all Webb would admit to was a peculiar sensation in my limbs, somewhat similar to that which is often felt after the first day of the cricket season. The public swooned. British understatement, manly humility, and a reference to cricket. He went straight into the Victorian pantheon of national heroes.
Webb's success was seen as a trophy for the whole country. Everything from mugs to matchboxes celebrated his achievement.
When Captain Webb first thought that he
And songs were written in his honour.
He said, "I'll take no jersey, for there's one already there. I'll leave alone the Bolton dress, the Mackintosh and flannel, and wear a suit of British pluck, the one I always wear."
no one would repeat Webb's achievement for 36 years. This Superman swimmer was proof, to the British at least, of their national superiority.
These tests of endurance that British men are putting themselves through in these periods, the exploration, swimming the Channel, climbing mountains, trying to find the source of the Nile and so on, they were an extreme version of the stiff upper lip, proving that the Anglo-Saxon male could achieve anything, could suffer anything, and come out the other end robust and manly. And I think it was a bit pathological.
Webb's ultimate challenge was an attempt to swim across the foot of Niagara Falls. But he was dragged under by a whirlpool and died. In this case, British pluck wasn't enough. The British people's supreme confidence in their physical, mental and moral hardiness underpinned their achievements in the growing empire. This is what so many of those public school boys had been trained up for. They needed to be able to stare danger in the face and walk straight towards it.
No empire in history had ever expanded further or faster or revelled in such exotic battle honours. 1871-2, the Lushai Campaign. 1873-4, the Ashanti War.
Between 1870 and 1900, British territory increased by over 50%.
The battles of Rorke's Drift and Ulundi.
Every glorious, far-flung victory seemed to prove the very stuff of which those in the fabled Thin Red Line were made.
The capture of Mandalay.
By her Diamond Jubilee, the Queen Empress Victoria famously ruled over a quarter of the world's population.
1898, the Battle of Omdurman. In fact, there wasn't a single year in the entire reign of Queen Victoria when British forces were not fighting for the empire somewhere across the globe.
And the public back home lapped it up. High-spirited adventure stories by the likes of Rider Haggard, Rudyard Kipling and the prolific G.A. Henty thrilled a British society increasingly besotted with imperialism. Indeed, ordinary British men and women were encouraged to believe that they had a stake in something magnificent. But the truth was that colonial rule was built on something astonishingly flimsy. The control of vast populations rested in the hands of only a tiny number of men. And the illusion that the British were all-powerful was maintained by an extraordinary piece of theatre.
At the centre of the performance were the iconic figures of the unflappable Englishman and his wife, the doughty Memsahib. It was a grand masque of stoic control, played out in inappropriate dress. The stiff upper lip gave the British an image of themselves that allowed them to feel that somehow they deserved the benefits of the trade and the conquest, that the civilising mission that they talked about was genuine, that there were values behind the military force and the commercial enterprise. The British would never have described themselves as having anything as grand as an ideology, but they had an attitude. The stiff upper lip kept the whole show, and it was a show, together.
The days of empire might be over, but its legacy does live on in the 21st century. I'm going to see a politician, administrator and adventurer who has both studied and, in a sense, lived a version of the imperial show. MP Rory Stewart was educated at Eton and Oxford, and at only 30 was the deputy governor of 2 provinces of occupied Iraq.
I found it one of the most satisfying, exciting jobs I've ever done. You get to be a knight in shining armour, you get to be a hero from a fairy tale,
Did you, as a child, read any Empire literature? Were you taken with tales of imperial derring-do?
Yes, definitely. And I think it's very important, because I think that sort of history created the culture and the unwritten rules by which you knew how to react. I mean, I felt the first time I actually went out with my compound under siege and the heavy machine guns are going and people are trying to crawl over the roof, and you feel that somehow your dreams and your early childhood reading have suddenly coincided with your life and you know exactly what to do, and that's an incredibly powerful experience.
What's clear from your accounts is you appear to have been unflappable. You didn't panic. I mean, this is classic British stiff upper lip. Was that important?
I think incredibly important. I mean, when I was attacked in the compound in Iraq, and we'd been up, I think by that stage, for about 3 nights without sleep. There were 140 rockets and mortars coming to the compound. I remember very, very clearly going back to my room and how important it was to change my shirt, put on a tie, shave, and come back again with a big smile on my face.
So what does the stiff upper lip mean to you?
I think the stiff upper lip, to me, has its main quality not in courage but in truthfulness. That sense of modesty, of understatement, of seriousness, which actually made us work, which stopped us being just stiff-fronted buffoons, but actually made us some of the most canny, energetic, well-informed, flexible and successful people of the 19th century.
There's no doubt that this British attitude was critical to the nation's success. But as the empire went from strength to strength, this national achievement started to be regarded as somehow racially determined. The imperial mission appeared to be gaining the stamp of scientific credibility. Anthropologists believed they'd found proof of a racial hierarchy, with so-called savages at the bottom and civilized Anglo-Saxons at the top. And how did they arrive at this, to us, shocking and suspiciously convenient conclusion? By taking a ruler to the human body.
'19th century scientists were very keen on measuring skulls. And this is an authentic piece of apparatus, and I come out at 160 millimetres. Now, if we compare that with this skull, which is that of an African, you see, mine is much bigger. Therefore, as a European, I have a much bigger brain, and I'm much cleverer. That's science. I am simplifying a bit, but that was more or less the conclusion. And equally scientific in the 1870s was the theory that not only are native and colonial peoples' brains smaller, but their characters are weaker. The authority for this was no less a figure than Darwin, who said that Englishmen rarely cry. He deduced this from comparing the emotional restraint of his fellow countrymen with the emotional incontinence of native people. He wrote, "Savages weep copiously from very slight causes." He gave the example of a native chief in New Zealand who had cried like a child because the sailors spoilt his favourite cloak by powdering it with flour. Nowadays, we might call that a traveller's anecdote, but in those days, that was cold scientific fact. In the emotional survival of the fittest, the British were going to win. Science seemed to be confirming what the British had suspected all along. As the great imperialist Cecil Rhodes is supposed to have said, to be born an Englishman is to win first prize in the lottery of life. The new suggestion that national success was based not on divine providence, but a sort of racial evolution, added a rather darker side to the triumph of the stiff upper lip.
In the later 19th century, there was a shift from Darwinism to what became known as neo-Darwinism, or sometimes ultra-Darwinism. And if you like, it hardened the kind of the scientific racism of the time. And you find in writers like Francis Galton the founding father of eugenics. This view that it was unfortunate, but other races, almost certainly because of their physical, emotional and moral weakness, would become extinct gradually because of the great superiority of the white races that were settling all around the world. And this was unfortunate, but inevitable.
Whilst across the globe the white man seemed to be forging ahead, closer to home it appeared that the Anglo-Saxon race was under threat from within. The underbelly of Britain's industrial slums. Glasgow was grandly known as the Empire's second city. But there were worries about the degenerate stock of its poorest elements. And this was a time when Britain needed them to be on side. The unfortunate truth was that Britain had taught other nations to play up and play the game, and now they were vying to beat her at it. Germany, all Prussian rigour and awesomely synchronised calisthenics, was becoming a military player with real steel. And America's can-do spirit and clean-cut zeal mirrored its accelerating economic pace. It was all a bit worrying.
If Great Britain wanted to remain top of the league and to stay ahead of the serious international competition, then it desperately needed to improve the quality of its next generation of players. The physical and moral health of the urban poor, particularly that of adolescents, was considered to be so bad as to be endangering the whole national enterprise. The raw material just wasn't good enough. It needed to be knocked into shape. But neither the boys' hard-pressed families, nor their basic schools, nor their uninviting churches were doing the job. So what could be done with them?
The solution was obvious. The instilment of military discipline, moral fibre, and a lot of jolly good fun.
Company fall in.
Everyone's heard of its more famous cousin, the Boy Scouts, established in 1907. But 24 years earlier, in Glasgow, Sunday school teacher William Smith founded this pioneering group.
God our Father.
The Boys Brigade.
Activities of the Boys Brigade. We are part of this company.
This is the 5th company of the Boys Brigade in Glasgow, going strong since 1885.
Amen.
The Boys Brigade had what was in every sense a mission statement: the advancement of Christ's kingdom amongst boys and the promotion of habits of reverence, discipline, self-respect and all that tends towards a true Christian manliness. It's the perfect expression of classic Victorian muscular Christianity, but this time geared towards the working classes.
Just like at the public schools before them, misbehaviour was to be averted by a heady dose of God and games, fresh air and fair play. In 1891, the brigade's honorary vice-president, Henry Drummond, issued every member with an inspirational present.
This is a special Christmas story that Drummond wrote, called Baxter's Second Innings. And of course, it's about cricket. Or rather, it's ostensibly about cricket. In fact, it's the captain of a cricket team giving a lecture to a boy, Baxter, about the great game of life. And it's an extended allegory. So he tells him that the bowler is temptation, throwing sneaky balls at you. And you, as a boy, have to guard your wicket with the 3 stumps of truth, honour, and purity. He says, I tell you, it's all written down. Where? On the scoring sheet. What scoring sheet? Your scoring sheet. Your character. Oh, groaned Baxter. Yes, exclaimed the captain, almost mercilessly. "It's all there. Every innings you play, every run you make, and every ball you miss. There's not a mistake on that sheet, not an omission. Character cannot lie. Character cannot be taken in. Character hides nothing. It forgets nothing."
It may seem absurd, a bit contrived, but the boys loved it.
So what does it feel like wearing the uniform?
It feels really good because you feel proud and that you're a part of something, like a community. And well, I feel really proud and good in it.
How much religion is there?
There's a lot.
Yeah, a lot-ish.
Yeah, a lot-ish, yeah.
Do you feel it's keeping you in check? Or do you think it's, would you run wild if you weren't here?
Possibly, yeah.
So what does this give you then? Somewhere to go?
Yes, yeah. Somewhere to go, something to do, people to be with.
The Boys Brigade was a huge success, partly because it allowed all classes and all backgrounds to share in the idealised national identity. The stiff upper lip was, in a sense, being mass-produced. Drummond himself uses the word machinery to describe the new movement, which was designed for turning out boys rather than savages. Yet, as the century neared its end, alongside concern about the poverty and the squalor and the ugliness of the cities, there were stirrings of criticism for this homogenised industrial approach to character building, as though it was a process that could be managed like forging steel or constructing ships. Was the spirit of the age crushing the human spirit?
Some people thought the answer was a passionate yes. Towards the end of the century, there were cries of dissent against the dehumanising effect of Victorian culture. They came first from a group of artists, designers and writers. The aesthetic movement, as they became known, thought human potential could best be developed through art. They thought the beauty of a bridge was more important than its function, and they celebrated uniqueness over conformity. Their self-appointed spokesman and pin-up was Oscar Wilde, with his flamboyant attire and hedonistic lifestyle. Wilde described Oxford, where he studied, as the most beautiful thing in England. No small praise, because for Wilde, nothing could possibly be more important than beauty.
Looking out over the dreaming spires, you can see why Oscar Wilde and his fellow aesthetes became fixated by beauty. They were inspired by the work of an Oxford Don, Walter Pater, who wrote that the key to success in life was to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame to maintain this ecstasy. For these intellectuals, emotions were not to be suppressed. Rather, they were the key to fulfilment, perhaps the very point of existence itself. Nothing could be further from the stiff upper lip.
The funny thing is that with the cult of beauty, which came with the aesthetic movement, we went back, to a large extent, to the origin of this cult of beauty, which was the Romantic movement, and which was, obviously, the cult of the emotions, the cult of pathos, a world where pathetic didn't mean awful and bad. In fact, quite a useful little example there, semantically speaking. What other language in the world uses pathetic as a term of abuse? Pathos is the feeling that we all cultivate in order to show that we're human beings, but the Victorians repressed it.
The assault on the emotionally restrained establishment came not only from arty types. It had many champions and pursued many shocking new causes. At the same time, disturbing continental mood swings were finding their way across the Channel, a whole troublesome cocktail of fin de siècle anxieties. The turbulence would culminate with Freud exposing the strange, unconscious world of the self. Even the most sturdy and resolute Englishman might understandably have been overcome. One disaffected intellectual who nonetheless understood the deeply conservative nature of the English character was the writer E.M. Forster. In later life, he became a national institution. But as a homosexual, writing in Edwardian England, Forster's most intense feelings were outlawed by society. Perhaps understandably, he harboured a desire for a more emotionally open way of life, and he urged his readers to communicate as human beings. His epigraph to the novel Howard's End, published in 1910, sums it up with the words, "Only connect."
Forster had been to public school, an experience he hated. He wrote in later life, in an essay on the English character, that the educational system was adept at producing Englishmen with well-developed bodies, fairly developed minds, and undeveloped hearts. Forster didn't believe that the English were innately unfeeling. It was just that they had been taught to, as he put it, bottle up their emotions.
And it was this entrenched self-control that Forster saw as not only limiting for the individual, but also extremely dangerous.
In his 1907 novel, The Longest Journey, the hero, Ricky, who's been bullied at public school, urges a girl whose fiancé has just been killed to express her feelings, to mind. It's the worst thing that can ever happen to you in all your life, and you've got to mind it. You've got to mind it. They'll come saying, bear up, trust to time. No, they're wrong. Mind it.
These ripples of opposition to the stiff upper lip may have begun as a rarefied intellectual critique of establishment values. But a decade or so into the 20th century, they were rapidly gaining momentum. And they might have developed into a great wave of dissent, had not something happened which would halt the advancing tide. In 1914, thousands of young men, fresh from the playing fields of Great Britain, had to prove their mettle on the battlefields of France. Many hoped they could live up to the soldier heroes ingrained in their consciousness. And the press fueled this patriotic resolve. An article in the Times to all officers advised, "Keep men by you with a stiff upper lip when you're facing the finish, and when nothing remains but the honour of the regiment." And resolve was never more necessary than at the front, when rallying the men to go over the top.
At 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, the 8th Battalion of the East Surrey Regiment were in their trenches here, near Carnoy, waiting for the whistle to go over the top and attack German positions around the village of Montauban, over there. It was the first day of the Battle of the Somme.
The commander of B Company, a former public school head prefect and hero of the sports field, Captain Billy Neville, had brought with him his choice of secret weapons: footballs.
This is one of those very footballs. The lettering's rubbed off, but one of the balls originally said, "The Great European Cup, the final. East Surreys versus Bavarians. Kick-off at 0. Captain Neville kicked one of the balls out into no man's land as the signal to advance. A private Furzy kicked another, and the men charged after. There was a prize for whichever platoon managed to dribble the ball over enemy lines first. They were, quite literally, treating war as a game. To us, it seems ludicrous, but to Neville, the football was a standard, a rallying point for the troops, something familiar and inspiring amidst the noise and the horror. And in a sense, it worked. They took the village and the German lines. Incredibly, the football survived. Captain Neville didn't.
Captain Neville and Private Furzy were killed in the attack, along with 145 men from their battalion. And it didn't take long for news of the fatal game to reach the public back home.
The Daily Mail published a verse in tribute on the 12th of July. On through the hail of slaughter, where gallant comrades fall, where blood is poured like water, they drive the trickling ball. The fear of death before them is but an empty name. True to the land that bore them, the Surreys play the game. It's terrible, but it's terribly moving. And you can't stand here without feeling the loss of these young men, the loss of innocence, the loss of a certain kind of idealism. This poem, written back at home, safe in England with its jolly jingoistic tone, shows that they had no idea of the scale of what was happening where Neville and the Surreys were fighting. No idea of the horror, the waste, the volume of death that was occurring on the Somme.
Nearly 20,000 British men died on that first day of the Somme alone. This stands as the worst loss of life in one day in the history of the British Army. It's really hard, in a place like this, to know what to think about the stiff upper lip. It's difficult not to admire those who adopted it, but easy to feel angry at its consequences. What had helped us build an empire had also perhaps allowed us to sleepwalk into a national catastrophe and keep on walking. Surely this was the point that something in the ideal of the British character had to change.
I feel the First World War proved that the stiff upper lip came with a price. Never again was there the same confidence, the same swagger about that form of Britishness. There was still resistance, fortitude, resilience, an ability to survive, but it was no longer accompanied by enthusiasm, optimism, delight, confidence, swagger. All that had gone.
So was this the end of the stiff upper lip? Or would it prove more resilient and more adaptable than that? Next week, we keep calm and carry on.
After the subcontinent here on BBC HD at 9 o'clock tomorrow with Welcome to India. Next tonight, though, music, later live with Jules Holland.